The storm came like a spirit, howling through the peaks of the winter mountains, burying all in its wake. But one man, guided by the wisdom of his ancestors and the power of the earth, would stand against the blizzard, his shelter more than a home, a testament to the ancient ways of survival. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if the spirit of survival stirs you, subscribe because tomorrow's tale runs even deeper than this one. The mountain winds had been silent for days, a deep stillness hanging over the land, the kind that foretold change. Then, one morning in the season when the earth began to shrink beneath the weight of winter, the winds awoke. They began their whispers low, but soon grew into a growl, as if the land itself was preparing to rage against the sky. The sky, in turn, seemed to listen, darkening with the weight of an incoming storm. In the small village nestled in the valley of the Black Hills, all the people felt it. The storm was not just a weather pattern. It was a force of nature, a spirit that had not been appeased in many years. For days the sky had shifted through shades of blue, signaling the end of the autumn winds. But now, as the first snowfall began to fall upon the land, it came down like whispers from the mountains, gentle at first, before gaining strength with each hour. Among the village's inhabitants, one man stood prepared. His name was Wee-Ya-Ya, a name given by his father meaning wind seeker. Wee-Ya-Ya had walked the mountains for as long as he could remember, listening to the winds, understanding the changes in the air. The storms, to him, were like old relatives. They came with warnings and guidance, and when they arrived, he was ready. Yet, this was no ordinary storm. He could feel it in his bones. This one was unlike the others. It was as if the spirits of the land themselves were testing the people. Wee-Ya-Ya had long since learned that the land could be as harsh as it was kind. He had heard stories of such storms from his elders, but never had he experienced one quite like this. It was the kind of storm that could freeze rivers solid, that could take away the animals from their tracks and bury those who were not prepared. He had often spoken of it to his younger brother, Viaka, urging him to build his shelter deeper into the earth, where the spirits of his ancestors would keep him safe. With snowflakes beginning to fall heavily, Wee-Ya-Ya stood outside his dwelling and gazed into the distance. He could already see the dark clouds approaching, the wind bending the tops of the tall pines that had stood firm for centuries. The horses in the distance turned their heads, sensing the same unrest that stirred inside him. The trees groaned under the wind's touch, their leaves now gone, only the naked branches left to defend themselves. The earth was growing cold. The time for waiting was over. Turning toward his shelter, he knew the next few days would demand more than simple survival. His shelter, built deep beneath the earth, was meant not just to keep him safe from the cold, but to honor the spirits of the land. It was a symbol of respect the land gave, and it took, but in Wee-Ya-Ya's case, it would give him the strength to endure. The earth beneath his feet held ancient knowledge, and he, like his ancestors before him, had learned to listen. Wee-Ya-Ya's shelter was unlike the others in the village. It was not built above the earth, as most homes were, but instead carved into the mountain itself, a secret passed down through generations. His father had taught him this way of building, a tradition that connected them to the spirits of the land. The design was simple yet profound. The earth would provide warmth and protection, and in return, Wee-Ya-Ya would honor it by keeping the shelter hidden from the outside world. The entrance, barely visible under the layer of snow, was tucked away behind a thicket of brush and trees. It had been carefully chosen, not for ease, but for security. Wee-Ya had spent many years clearing the area of any extraneous growth, making sure that no one could easily stumble upon the shelter. The stone steps, weathered by years of use, led him down into the cool embrace of the earth. As he descended, he felt the warmth of the shelter ahead, a stark contrast to the cold air that whipped through the trees above. Inside, the air was still, and the shelter was filled with a comforting warmth. The walls were made of stone, smooth and firm, having absorbed the heat from the sun during the warmer months. Now, as the storm approached, they held that warmth, creating a safe haven from the coming blizzard. The ceiling, arched from logs and bark, held strong against the weight of the earth above, and the roof was thick with layers of snow packed tightly to prevent the cold from seeping in. At the center of the shelter was a fire pit, carefully tended with dried wood that had been gathered from the surrounding forest. The fire crackled softly, sending tendrils of smoke up through a chimney that Weeyaya had constructed himself. He had designed the chimney to funnel smoke upward without giving away their position, ensuring that no one would be able to see the smoke rising from the shelter. As he looked around, Weeyaya felt a deep sense of pride. The shelter was not large by any means, just enough room for him, his brother, and their few belongings. The walls were lined with animal furs, skillfully sewn together by the women of their tribe. Above them, the roof had been crafted from the bark of the tallest trees in the forest, providing both insulation and strength. Everything inside had been placed with care and purpose, designed to withstand not only the storm outside, but the harshness of life in the mountains. Weeyaya's father had always said that the land gave everything, but it also took. The earth was not simply a place to live. It was a partner, a teacher, and a provider. As long as Weeyaya treated it with respect, the land would protect him. And as the storm's winds howled in the distance, Weeyaya felt the full weight of that lesson. He was ready. The shelter, built deep within the earth, would keep him safe. It would stand firm, as it always had, against the fury of nature. The wind shifted with a low groan, like an ancient voice stirring in the deep. Weeyaya stood just outside the entrance of his shelter, eyes trained on the horizon where the storm was beginning to take shape. The air grew thick with the scent of snow and ice, and the once clear sky was now choked with dark clouds that seemed to churn and pulse with an ominous energy. It was a storm unlike any he had felt before. The land was still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the first sign of the tempest's arrival. Weeyaya could feel the pressure mounting in the air, the quiet before the storm. He knew that this was not just any winter storm. There was something in the way the winds howled, in the way the clouds gathered, that made his skin tingle with an unsettling awareness. He had seen many storms in his life, but this one seemed to carry the weight of a warning. The horses in the valley below began to stir, their ears flicking back nervously as they sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Weeyaya's own horse, a sturdy mare with a coat the color of chestnut, snorted softly from her pen. Even she, who had weathered many winters, seemed uneasy. Weeyaya watched them for a moment, then turned back to his shelter. Inside, his younger brother Viaka was sharpening his spear. The soft scrape of the stone against the metal, a steady rhythm that echoed in the otherwise silent space. "Weeyaka, Weeyaya," called softly, stepping inside. His brother looked up, his brow furrowed with concern. "The storm is coming fast," Weeyaya said. "We must prepare. We will need enough firewood to last through the worst of it. The winds are strong, and the snow will pile up quickly." Weeyaka nodded, setting his spear aside. "How long do you think it will last?" he asked, standing to gather the necessary tools. Weeyaya paused for a moment, his eyes turning back to the darkening sky. "It could be days, maybe longer. The storm feels like one that will bury us, and we must be ready for that." Outside, the wind began to pick up, whipping the snow in sharp gusts that stung Weeyaya's face as he stepped back out into the cold. He moved quickly, gathering what firewood they had stored and piling it carefully near the shelter. Each piece of wood was important. There was no room for waste. The storm would test them in ways they had not yet experienced. As the first flakes of snow began to fall, they danced in the wind, swirling and spiraling through the air. The temperature dropped swiftly, and the ground began to harden beneath Weeyaya's boots. He looked around, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. The mountain had always given, but it could also take. The storm was a reminder of nature's power, and he would need every bit of his wisdom and strength to survive it. The wind had ceased, leaving a stillness that felt unnatural. The storm had grown quiet, as if it were pausing, gathering strength for what was to come. Weeyaya stood outside, his breath visible in the cold air, and watched the world around him. The snow had fallen thick, covering the land in a white blanket that stretched as far as the eye could see. The trees, once standing tall, now bent under the weight of the snow, their branches heavy and low to the ground. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time. The village, the land, even the storm seemed to hold its breath. Weeyaya had lived through many winters, but this one felt different. It was as though the mountain itself was preparing for something greater, something beyond the usual cycles of snow and ice. He turned back to his shelter. Inside, the fire still crackled, its warmth a comforting presence amidst the cold. Weeyaka was busy preparing their food for the coming days, his movements purposeful and calm. The shelter, though small, was built for endurance. The stone walls and thick roof would keep them safe as the storm raged outside. It was a place of refuge, not just from the elements, but from the uncertainty of the world beyond. Weeyaya sat down beside the fire, pulling his cloak tighter around him. He had learned long ago that in times like these, patience was as important as preparation. The storm would come in full force soon enough, but for now there was only the silence. He could hear the faint sound of snow falling outside, the gentle hiss of the wind as it moved through the trees. It was a quiet that pressed in on him, a reminder that the world was not always kind. In the distance, the horses had settled into their pens, the quietness of the storm perhaps calming them. Weeyaye's mare was among them, standing still and alert, as if she too sensed the change in the air. He could not afford to lose focus. The storm had not yet reached its peak, and it would not be long before the winds picked up again. He had to be ready. His thoughts turned to his ancestors, to the wisdom they had passed down. They had lived through storms far worse than this, relying on their knowledge of the land and the shelter it provided. The earth was a silent partner, offering safety when needed, but demanding respect in return. Weeyaya understood that the storm was not just a test of his ability to survive, but a challenge to his understanding of the land's rhythms. The mountain could be as unforgiving as it was beautiful, and survival here was as much about respect as it was about strength. The fire flickered and cast long shadows across the stone walls. Weeyaya closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth wash over him. The storm would come soon, but for now the shelter held. It was enough. The storm returned with a vengeance, as the winds howled louder than ever, tearing at the earth itself. What had been a quiet lull was shattered by the roar of the wind, fierce and relentless. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, swirling in every direction as the blizzard unleashed its full fury. The temperature plunged, and the cold seeped into everything, reaching deep into the bones of the land. Inside the shelter, Weeyaya felt the earth hold steady beneath his feet. The fire crackled and popped in the center of the room, its warmth a thin but comforting barrier against the fury outside. Weeyaka was busy tending to the food, making sure it would last through the storm. There was little else they could do. The storm would rage for as long as it wished. Weeyaya's thoughts turned inward. He could hear the storm growing louder, the wind picking up speed and force as it pummeled the trees. The shelter, carved into the mountain, stood strong. The stone walls were thick and solid, and the roof was reinforced with layers of snow and earth. It was built to endure, and it would. The shelter was a symbol of the respect he had for the land, the mountain, and the wisdom passed down by his ancestors. It would stand against the storm, just as it had withstood countless others before. But Weeyaya knew that the storm was not just a test of the shelter. It was a test of his own resolve, a challenge to see if he could survive in the face of nature's wrath. The land could be both a protector and a destroyer, and survival depended on understanding that balance. His ancestors had learned this long ago, and Weeyaya had inherited their knowledge. Outside, the horses were no longer visible. The snow had drifted deep, and the wind had obscured their forms entirely. Weeyaya could only hope they were safe in their pens, sheltered from the worst of the storm. He had prepared for this, just as his father had taught him. He had made sure the animals had enough food, enough shelter, and enough protection to survive the blizzard. As the wind picked up, it began to shake the shelter. Wee Ya's gaze shifted toward the entrance, where the snow had started to pile up against the doorway. He would need to reinforce it soon, before the storm buried them completely. The earth, as always, would hold. But it was the small, quiet moments of preparation that mattered most. The fire flickered again, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. Wee Ya's mind drifted back to the stories his elders had told him. They spoke of storms that could swallow entire villages, of winters so long and cold that even the strongest had been brought to their knees. Yet those who had respected the land, who had listened to its warnings, had survived. The storm raged on, but inside the shelter, Wee Ya felt a deep, steady calm. The storm could come. It could roar and rage, but it would not break him. Days passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The winds howled relentlessly, the snow falling in sheets so thick that the world beyond the shelter was swallowed by whiteness. Wee Ya had ventured outside briefly, only to be struck by the full force of the blizzard. The cold pierced through his layers of clothing, and the wind tore at his skin like sharp claws. He quickly retreated back into the warmth of the shelter, where the fire still burned steadily, casting a soft glow across the room. Inside, his brother Weeaka worked in silence, his face set in a determined expression. The storm had forced them to adapt, to ration their food and firewood carefully. Wee Ya could feel the weight of the storm pressing in, the suffocating silence that came with being trapped in a world of snow and wind. Outside, the storm raged on, but in the shelter there was a strange sense of peace, as if the earth itself was holding them safe within its grasp. As the storm continued, Wee Ya found his thoughts wandering to his ancestors. They had endured storms far worse than this, some lasting weeks on end. They had known that survival in the mountains wasn't just about physical strength, but about understanding the rhythms of the land. The snow and wind were as much a part of the world as the sun and the trees. To survive, one had to learn to live in harmony with these forces, to respect their power and their unpredictability. Wee Ya had been taught this from a young age. His father had always said that the land would provide, but only to those who treated it with respect. The storm had already claimed much of the land around them. Wee Ya had seen the trees bending under the weight of the snow, their branches snapping like brittle bones. The horses had disappeared beneath the drifts, their forms barely visible in the sea of white. Wee Ya could only hope they were safe, that the shelter had held strong against the storm's fury. The animals were resilient, but this was a storm that tested even the strongest of creatures. The fire in the shelter flickered, casting long shadows against the stone walls. The warmth from the fire was a small comfort, but it was enough to keep the chill at bay. Wee Ya felt a deep connection to the shelter, to the earth beneath his feet, and the mountain that had given him this refuge. It was more than just a place to live. It was a sacred space, a symbol of his bond with the land and his ancestors. The shelter had been built with care, with wisdom passed down through generations. It had endured countless storms, and it would endure this one as well. The winds outside howled louder, but inside, Wee Ya found peace. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the storm's fury, and realized that the storm, as powerful as it was, could not break him. The storm had finally reached its peak. The winds were relentless, their fury tearing at the land, while the snow continued to fall in thick, unyielding layers. The world outside had become a frozen wasteland, where nothing moved and everything stood still beneath the weight of the snow. The trees were bent low, their branches heavy with ice and snow, and the once familiar landscape had become unrecognizable, swallowed by the blizzard's grasp. Inside the shelter, Wee Ya and his brother Weeaka huddled close to the fire, the warmth from the flames a small comfort against the cold that had gripped the world outside. Wee Ya watched the flames dance, their flickering light casting shadows across the stone walls. The fire, like the earth, was a force of life, but even it seemed small compared to the storm's fury. For a moment, Wee Ya closed his eyes, listening to the howling wind outside. The storm was a force of nature, a reminder of the power the land held. He thought back to the stories his father had told him, tales of storms that had once buried entire villages, of winters so fierce that even the bravest had been forced to flee. It was a humbling thought, realizing that the land could give so much, yet take so much in return. His father had often said that the earth was a balance take too much, and it would take back what it had given. Wee Yaya opened his eyes and looked at his brother, who had begun to stir the fire, adding another piece of wood to the pit. Viakaya's face was tense, his brow furrowed with concern, but there was a calm in his movements. He was learning. They both were. The storm was not something they could fight. It was something they had to survive, something they had to understand. They had been taught to respect the land, to listen to it, and in doing so they would find their way through the harshest of trials. Outside, the world had been transformed. The snow had fallen thick, covering everything in a heavy, suffocating blanket. The horses were now completely buried, their forms hidden beneath the drifts. Wee Yaya could only imagine what lay beyond the shelter. He knew the animals had found shelter of their own, but the sheer weight of the storm made it difficult to even see them, let alone reach them. Wee Yaya shifted his gaze to the small window near the back of the shelter. The snow had built up against it, blocking any view of the outside world. It was as though they were entirely cut off from the land, isolated in their shelter, surrounded by a sea of snow. Yet, even in this silence, Wee Yaya felt a deep connection to the world beyond. The storm was just another part of the land cycle, another test to endure. With the wind howling outside and the world frozen in place, the shelter stood firm. Wee Yaya knew that, no matter how fierce the storm became, they would survive. The earth had protected them, and it would continue to do so. As the storm continued its violent rage, Wee Yaya found himself drawn into memories of his ancestors, their wisdom a steady force against the howling winds outside. The fire crackled softly, the only sound that could be heard in the shelter's stillness. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the flames seep into his bones, while the cold remained outside, battering the earth. It was in moments like these that he felt the presence of his ancestors the most. Their teachings were alive within him, their spirits whispering on the winds that tore at the shelter. Wee Yaya had been taught that survival was not just about strength, but about understanding. His father had said that the earth was a living being, and to survive, one had to learn its language, to listen to the wind, the trees, and the mountains, to watch the cycles of the seasons, and to respect the forces of nature. The storm outside was part of those cycles, a reminder that the land could be as unforgiving as it was generous. The land would give, but it would also take, and Wee Yaya had learned long ago that the price of living on the earth was understanding its ways. His father's voice echoed in his mind, a steady reminder. The land gives you shelter, but it will ask for something in return. Wee Yaya had often wondered what that something was, but as the storm raged on, he knew the answer. It was respect. The land required respect, patience, and understanding. The storm was not an enemy to be fought. It was a challenge to endure, and endurance was the legacy of his people. Wee Yaya's thoughts shifted to the shelter. It was a place of refuge, yes, but it was more than that. It was a bridge between the world of his ancestors and the world he now inhabited. His ancestors had built shelters like this, deep within the earth, to protect themselves from the storms that could take life in the harsh winters. They had carved out spaces in the land itself, respecting the mountain, the trees, and the animals that lived there. Their knowledge of the land had been passed down through generations, and now it was his turn to carry that knowledge forward. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the wind howled with greater intensity. But Wee Yaya remained still, grounded in the knowledge of the earth. He could feel the pulse of the mountain beneath him, the steady rhythm of the land that had carried his people for generations. His ancestors had endured far worse storms than this, and so would he. The shelter was not just a home, it was a testament to their survival, their wisdom, and their connection to the land. As the storm raged on, Weeya's mind drifted back to the stories his father had told him, stories of the land, the animals, and the forces of nature that shaped the world. They had survived because they had understood the rhythms of the earth, and now it was his turn to carry that knowledge into the future. The storm's fury finally began to wane, and the winds that had once screamed through the mountains became a whisper. Weeya stood at the entrance of the shelter, his gaze fixed on the landscape beyond. The snow had not stopped falling entirely, but the air had begun to clear, the heavy clouds lifting just enough to let a pale light filter through. The world outside was transformed, covered in a blanket of white, soft and still, as though the earth itself was sleeping, recovering from the storm's rage. Weeya stepped outside, his boots crunching against the fresh snow. The cold still gripped the air, but the worst had passed. The world, though blanketed in snow, felt different. The storm had done its work, testing their resolve, their strength. It had taken everything, but in return it had given them something more valuable: the knowledge that they could endure. The shelter had stood firm, and so had they. As he walked through the snow, the weight of the past few days lifted from his shoulders. The earth beneath him felt solid, resilient, and he could feel the first stirrings of life beneath the frozen surface. The animals, once hidden beneath the heavy snow, were now emerging, cautiously venturing back into the world. The birds began to sing, their songs piercing the stillness. For the first time in days, Weeya heard the familiar sounds of life returning to the land. He glanced back toward the shelter. Inside, Weeya was already preparing the fire again, the warmth of the flames beginning to fill the space. Weeya smiled to himself, knowing that they had made it through. The shelter had held, the storm had passed, and the world outside was slowly returning to life. For a moment he allowed himself to breathe in the cool, crisp air. The storm had been a reminder, a test of both body and spirit. But now the storm was over, and the earth would begin its slow, quiet recovery. The mountain had endured, and so had he. Weeya's thoughts drifted to his ancestors once more. They had known that the land would always test them, just as the storm had tested him. But they had also known that survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about balance. It was about knowing when to stand firm and when to yield. It was about understanding that the land would give, but it would also take. The storm had taken much, but it had also left something behind, the gift of survival, of understanding. As Weeya stood there, watching the land begin to heal, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the shelter, for the earth, and for the teachings of his ancestors. The storm had been fierce, but it had only deepened his connection to the land. It had shown him that survival wasn't just about enduring the storm, it was about learning to live with it, to respect it, and to let it shape him. The first light of spring, soft and promising, began to break through the clouds. It was the quiet beginning of something new. The storm had passed, and with it a quiet peace settled over the land. Weeya stood at the edge of the shelter, watching the snow slowly begin to melt, revealing the earth beneath. The mountains, which had once seemed so powerful and untouchable, now felt soft and yielding, the snow slowly receding as the seasons turned. It was as if the storm had been a test, not only of his own endurance, but of the earth's resilience. The mountain had been both a protector and a challenge, and now, in the quiet aftermath, it seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Inside the shelter, Weeya was already preparing for the next task. They had food to gather, firewood to replenish, and work to do. But there was no rush. The storm had shown them that life would continue, that the earth would offer what it could, but it was up to them to honor it. Weeya had learned that the land was not something to be conquered, but something to be understood, something to be respected. The storm had taught him that. It had forced him to listen to the wind, to the snow, to the earth beneath him. And now, as the storm faded into memory, he could hear the land again, not just the howl of the wind, but the quiet whispers of the trees, the rustle of the leaves, and the gentle stirrings of life as it began to emerge from the cold. Weeya looked over at the shelter once more. the place that had been both his home and his refuge. It was not just a structure, but a testament to the ways of his ancestors. The stone walls had held firm, the earth had embraced him, and the fire had burned bright. The shelter, carved deep into the land, had protected him through the worst the storm could offer. It was more than just a building, it was a connection to the past, to the teachings of the elders, and to the wisdom that had been passed down through generations. As he stood there, wee Yahya felt the weight of those teachings settle into his bones. The storm had been a reminder of the fragility of life, but it had also been a testament to the strength that came from understanding the land, from respecting it, and from living in harmony with it. He thought of his father, of the stories that had been shared around the fire, of the lessons that had been learned through trial and error, through endurance and patience. And he knew that he was not alone in this journey. He carried the spirits of his ancestors with him, their wisdom flowing through his veins, guiding him forward. The first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the land. It was the beginning of something new, a new cycle, a new season. And wee Yahya knew that the storm, though fierce, had been only a small part of the journey. The true test was how they moved forward, how they honored the land, and how they carried the lessons of the past into the future.